Today we're going to be building a property manager doc to track rent. The suggestion comes from my father-in-law who, for the past 20 years, has done this out of a spreadsheet. The beauty of this doc is that it gives you one master view across all units for when the next rent payments are due and what your cash flow will look like. It also gives you a view of who your current tenants are and an automatic way to send reminders through your Gmail account to each tenant for upcoming payments. If you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm Matt from Coda. Let's get started. First, I created a new doc by heading over to coda.new. Then, I added a set of pages for all the main tables I was going to create: tenants, units, leases, and payments. Starting with tenants. Tenants is a table that has all the information about a person that would stay in a unit: their name, phone number, email, etc. As my father-in-law mostly rents to students, that means that we'll include some guardian information as well. Next, I modeled out units. Each unit is like a room in a building. For now, I'm filling in some dummy data, so this is a bit easier to set up the right views later on. And I wanted an easy way to refer to each unit later, so I added an ID column using a combination of the address for the building and the unit number. And at this point, I realized I included an errant F in the formula. Leases are my third object for this doc. A lease represents an agreement between a tenant and a unit for a set period of time. So I've added a start date and an end date that the lease is valid from, along with a set of other properties like the security deposit amount and how much the lease is for. Finally, I want to create my payments table. Payments are at the center of what this doc is about. Payments represent an individual transaction within a lease. So if it's a 12-month lease and you pay quarterly, there would be 4 payments associated to that lease. For each payment, I want to create a lookup column to specify which lease it belongs to. As a friendly reminder, it is easier to build a doc with dummy data than blank. I also add another ID column so I can easily identify each payment. And finally, as tracking payments is one of the core parts of this doc, I'm going to add a select list column with each of the states a payment can be in. Next, I'm cleaning up some of the column formats for a payment, specifying date formats, etc. And most importantly, I'm starting to add the buttons that will make the workflow for this super smooth, like marking a payment as paid. The action for this button will be to modify this row, setting the status to paid. Finally, I'll disable the button for this payment if it is already marked as paid. Now it's time to start building out the views we want out of these 4 tables. To start, I'll clean up the list of pages a bit with clear icons and visuals, then add 2 new pages for my primary views, a dashboard across units and the schedule of upcoming payments. Next, I'll finish wiring together my tables. Starting with the leases table, I'll add a lookup column for tenants. Then, I'll add a lookup column for units. And finally, I'll clean up the column types for the rest of the table. Next, I'm going to add a default price for every unit, the amount paid per month, and then project it out from the unit lookup column for the lease. At this point, I'm realizing that I need to get some more dummy data in here to make it more easy to build out the doc. In this case, to add lease dates, I've decided that for each lease I'd specify a start date and a duration to determine what the end date will be using the relative date function. With that, I can calculate the total value of the lease. After filling in some dummy tenant data and associated leases, I'm now ready to generate the payment data for each lease. My plan for this is to create a button for each lease, which when you press it, it'll generate all the necessary rows in the payments table. I'll start by creating 2 buttons, one for the security deposit and one for the rent payment schedule. I'll configure the button to add a row to the payments table and set the values of that payment row to the current row's lease, security deposit amount, and type. At this point, I'm also specifying in the payments table that there are 2 types of payments: security deposits and rent payments. Finally, I'll set the due date for the payment to the lease's start date and will disable this button if a payment for this lease already exists. And now, this button works. This next part is the trickiest part. We're going to take what we just did with the security deposit, but we're going to generate a payment row for every month within the lease. We'll start by adding a Create Payment Schedule button. This button will add as many payment rows as there are months in the lease. To accomplish this, I'm using a formula map, starting with a sequence from 1 to the number of months in the lease, and then for each month in that sequence, we'll add a row to the payments table with the appropriate values. The monthly rent, and a due date that is offset by the current value in the sequence, and the type for rent versus a security deposit. Next, I'm adding a lookup column in the leases table to see all the associated payments for that lease. You can see all the security deposits for each row already. And finally, a test. And it works. We'll add the payment schedules for all the other leases now by clicking each button. Now it's time to start cleaning up our views and creating our dream screens. We'll start by creating conditional formats for each of the paid states, then adding one if the payment is overdue. We're also going to add a paid date to the Mark Paid button so we can keep track for when it happened. Let's start creating our dashboard view. First, I'll add a chart of the payments table that will have the schedule of payments over time and by their status, giving an overview of our expected cash flow. Realizing that I want to view this by month, I'll add a column to the payments table that truncates the date by month so I can chart by it. Next, we'll add a view of the unit table so we can see the current tenant information and payment summary for each room at a glance. I'll add a few columns: who the active tenant is, the summary of payments, and when the next payment is due. And to make those lookups easy, I'll add an active lease column to the view, pulling active leases for this unit based on today's date. At this moment, I realize my choice in dates in my dummy data was a bit stupid. It means none of them are going to show up in these filtered views in my dashboard, so I'm going to have to go back and change them. Now, based on that lease, I can project out the current occupants, the payments received, the payments outstanding, and the next payment date. And this is what it looks like with meaningful data. Next, we'll build out our upcoming payment reminders. The point of this view is to automatically send out email reminders to tenants that they have a payment due in 2 weeks ahead of the actual due date. To start, we'll create a view of the payments table where the status is not paid and the due date is before 14 days from now. Next, we're going to set up an automation that runs every day and queues up the payments in this filtered view for a reminder email by changing its status from scheduled to due. I've chosen to configure this logic with a button rather than put it in the automation itself for easier debugging later on. Let's test it out. It works. Now we'll add a button to send a reminder email. For this, we'll connect the Gmail pack to the dock, allowing the dock to send emails on our behalf. With the pack connected, we'll set the button action to send an email using those credentials. I'm going to address the email to both the tenant and their guardian. And the subject and content of the email to the tenant will be personalized to use their building and unit number along with the appropriate due date for their payment. I'll disable the button if the status for the payment is not set as due. Next, we'll add a button which changes the status for the payment to sent. To make the automation easier, we're going to make a third button that actually presses the first two buttons. The mark is sent button and the send email button. Let's try it out. Woohoo! It works. To finish this all up, we'll create a new automation that runs every day and presses the send reminder email button that combines both actions for payments which have the due status. We're all done. Let's go through and mark all these overdue payments as paid from this dummy data. And then head over to our dashboard to see what our cash flow will look like over the next few months. Looks like our chart needed one final sort to arrange it by the due date. And we're finished. If you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.